Now, before we move on to the next chapter on databases, let's make some final tweaks. First up, a few episodes ago, you'll remember that we added a route constraint to limit which characters we respond to as part of this wildcard here. However, now that we've changed how we load and fetch posts, I don't think this is needed anymore, so I'm going to remove it. A little bit cleaner too. And just to be safe, back in Firefox, load a post, and everything still works. But now, what if we add a slug that doesn't exist? We get this error page. And notice it's trying to load the view, and at this point it's blowing up because we're accessing properties off of null rather than an object. Okay, that's way too far for it to get. So let's come back to PHP Storm, and let's have a look here. First, I will introduce a variable, post, and then real quick we'll die and dump the post and have a look. Refresh. Aha, it's equal to null. And that would make sense if you think about it. If we come back to our find method, well, we get all of the posts in that directory, and then we try to find the first one with a matching slug. But in this case, there is no matching slug, so null is returned. So it sounds like we need to address that, and I'll show you a couple of different options. First, we might save this to a variable, and then we could say, well, if post is null, then we don't have a matching route. So once again, let's throw a new model not found exception. Or we could simply abort here. Okay, so now notice if I come back to Firefox and refresh, we get a 404, which is appropriate in this case. So now the only remaining step is to return the post otherwise. And I think that should do it. Okay, so again, back to our routes file. Let's get rid of that. And this should work once again. So that throws a 404, but if we go back to a valid post and refresh, that loads as we'd expect. Okay, so yep, this works, but there might be situations where you want to find a post without aborting and throwing an exception. It just depends. But if that were the case, you might do something like this. You might have one method called find, and then another method called find or fail. And find or fail would be the one that tracks down the post and then throws an exception if it couldn't find one. Whereas the general find method would still behave exactly as it did at the beginning of this video. But now notice we have introduced a little bit of duplication here. Not the end of the world, but it's also not necessary. So why don't we defer to static find slug from this method, and then we can act upon it. Okay, so now notice if I come back to Firefox and we access a slug that doesn't exist, now we see the error again. And that's what you'd expect, because in your routes file, you are calling find. But for the cases where we do want to fail if a post wasn't found, this is more appropriate. And now at this point, I can once again inline that to keep it nice and clean. Okay, so come back to Firefox, refresh. That throws a 404, which we want, and this one loads, and then we have our overview page. Okay, so I think that's enough for this particular chapter. And you've actually learned a lot. To be fair, we went pretty quick with some of this logic here, which can be a little scary at this stage in your learning, but if you stuck through it, you really should pat yourself on the back because you got a crash course in caching, collections, file handling, and even composer packages. So now, in the next chapter, we can move on to what you've probably been waiting for. Let's now switch it up and transition over to a MySQL database.